This is a story about faith. A story about a community of Roman Catholics. More specifically, a story about Black Catholics and their struggle and commitment to remain Catholic. This is a story about bigotry, oppression, and racism. In many ways, all that is bad and evil about the human spirit. At the same time, this is a story about hope, perseverance, and a steadfast, unrelenting faith in God. What we hope and trust is the good and honorable part of our humanity. It takes place in the Catholic Diocese of Belleville, Illinois. In reality, this story of our humanity, with all of its inherent flaws, as well as its decency, could have taken place in any number of American communities. For there are no boundaries to choke off and isolate prejudice and hatred. Ultimately, this is a story about people, a people of faith, whose trust in God called them to follow and live fully the gospel message of Jesus Christ in the church he himself began 2,000 years ago when he handed the keys of the kingdom to his apostle Peter.
The Catholic Church is a community of many stories. We are a people who lack no possible story or episode in our heritage. We came to be the church that we are by many circuitous events. Some of those events are not very pleasant. Some of those events are sinful, where Black people may have very well sought membership in the church, but were denied it.
When I first came to this church, I knew I wasn't welcome, but it was in walking distance to me. I was about 2 blocks away, so why go anywhere else? And I was determined I was coming here. I didn't care if all of them left, which they eventually did. But I'm still here after 30 years.
They could not go there. They could not go into those churches. They either had to come down. If you walked anywhere you got there, you had to walk down to St. Augustine. You could not go into those white churches.
So we were accustomed to being discriminated against because we were accustomed to that at our age group.
Black people are religious people. We are people of faith. And our experience of faith is probably one of the reasons we've survived in this nation, because our experience of a transcendent, loving God has been a powerful tonic that has allowed us to endure the great injustices and the difficulties and the violence that has been visited upon us.
Too often in our human history, prejudice, racism, and social injustice have left us deaf to the gospel message of Christ, namely, to love one another as he loves us, to see all people as we see ourselves, to understand that in the end we are all God's people, men and women, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters in Christ. Someone once said, "It is fear which breeds hatred and ultimately separation. Fear of what we don't understand, of someone who looks different or sounds different." Pope John Paul II has said, "There is no black church, no white church, no American church, but there is and must be in the one church of Jesus Christ, a home for blacks, whites, Americans, every culture and race." While the church herself, from the beginning, has called us to be one, the reality is that we are not. Racism is still a foremost obstacle.
Race is a defining issue in this nation, and while we've made progress, there is still progress to be made. We still need, as Americans, to understand that difference doesn't mean that things are bad. We still, as Americans, need to find ways to appreciate our dignity by not casting it against someone else because of color or because of ethnicity or because of religion. That my worth as a human being is not improved by my saying, well, at least I'm not like that person. Neither is it threatened by seeing the gifts and the talents of other people. Race is still a defining experience for us.
Belleville, Illinois is a small community of 43,000 people. The town, which sits about a dozen miles to the east of St. Louis, Missouri, is the largest in southern Illinois. It is here that the Diocese of Belleville extends its pastoral leadership to its Catholic residents in the 12,000 square miles and 28 counties which make up this southernmost diocese in the state. Southern Illinois is situated neatly between two of the nation's largest rivers, the Ohio on the south and the Mississippi on the west. The bulk of its rich land is used for farming. It is made up of sleepy hollows like Breeze, Caseyville, Redbud, and Millstock. Carbondale, Mount Vernon, Heron, and Waterloo are among the larger of the small communities. The most notable cities in southern Illinois are known more for the headlines they make than the people who live in them. River cities like East St. Louis on the northwest edge of the diocese and Cairo on its southern tip. The towns of St. LeBroy, St. John's, and St. Francisville are simple reminders that southern Illinois is deeply rooted in the Catholic Church. The first settlers here more than 300 years ago were French Jesuit priests, the first known white men to see the Mississippi River. In fact, they actually named it the River of the Immaculate Conception in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Well, southern Illinois originally was a French settlement. It came about in this way. The French had a lot of people up in Canada, and many of them wanted to farm in more year-round farmland. A lot of them wanted to move into the West to trade with the Indians, especially in furs. And so the first expedition, really, into this area, Father Marquette and Louis Joliet, was not looking for this area. It was looking to see whether the great river, which they had heard about, went into the South Seas or into the Gulf of Mexico. So the first expedition, Joliet and his group were merchants. Father Marquette was a missionary. And they built a fort at a place called Fort Charter, which is about, say 50 miles south of St. Louis on the east bank of the river. A cluster of settlements grew up there, French settlements, as well as a little bit south of there was an Indian village called Kaskaskia. Now that was Father Marquette's first mission. So this mission that Father Marquette called the Mission of the Immaculate Conception.
The missionaries were successful in their spiritual work. In 1700, a French soldier wrote about the Kaskaskia, Illinois Indians who inhabited the land. He said, "The Illinois are very industrious and quite skillful in tilling the soil. They work with a plow. The Jesuit fathers taught them how." Most of the Illinois are Catholics. There is a good-sized church with a baptismal font in their village. This church has a very neat interior. There are 3 chapels, the large choir chapel and 2 on the sides. They attend High Mass and Vespers regularly. Nearly all of the early explorers in North America were Catholic. The Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, and later the Germans, Italians, and Irish all brought priests with them to minister to their own spiritual needs and to spread the gospel of Jesus in the New World.
So the French who came either were farmers, and remember that whole area on the east bank of the river from Alton today to Kaskaskia, that rich prairie was the granary of the whole French Empire. And so as early as 1740, they were shipping grain down through New Orleans over back to France. The founding of the little village called then O'Harrisburg, and now Ruma, where my grandparents settled. Why did they settle there? It's rich land, and it was 7 miles from Puerto Rocher, 7 miles from Kaskaskia, so kind of on a triangle there. And it meant that there was a priest available, and the Irish were very much concerned with the church. That was a rather strong Irish community. It also was the first English-speaking parish in Illinois. Now, the third group, and larger group, were the Germans. Your young German Catholic fellows coming over, wanted to get land, wanted to be in a Catholic community.
Each nationality established a church and worshiped together in their own language. Churches became the heart of the community.
Looked upon the national church as a kind of a social organization, a homeland for the people, the Slovenes, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Germans, whatever group had a different language, and they had their own service in their own language, that is, the sermons, and the people would tend to stay there.
In the years between 1830 and 1860, the Catholic population in southern Illinois doubled, redoubled, and redoubled again. In 1887, Pope Leo XIII divided the Diocese of Alton and erected the Episcopal See of Belleville. The new diocese had 82 churches, 53 parochial schools, and 3 hospitals. It served 50,000 Catholics, including thousands of African Americans. Father Augustus Tolton was the only black priest in the United States at the time. He was part of the ceremony to consecrate the bishop of this new diocese.
So Augustus Tolton, we have the first clearly identified African-American priest who acknowledged his heritage and for his moment in history clearly identified with the struggles of African-American peoples. And Tolton was a part of the ceremonies at John Jansen's ordination and installation. So evidently there was a sense of mutual respect, if not affection, given the standards of the time.
The people of the new diocese were not wealthy. Most were foreign-born and represented more than 30 nationalities. With the arrival of each new wave of immigrants, misunderstandings and prejudice created tensions that would later erupt in violence. But there was one group of people who had been here almost from the beginning: the slaves who came here with their French owners.
This whole area of slavery in the French Empire was ordered by the French slave code, and it was pretty good, far better than Spanish and infinitely better than the British, because it required first, from the Christian standpoint, that the people had to be brought up in the faith. Secondly, it forbade the separation of families, which was a terrible thing that ever was done. And third thing, it had penalties against the molestation of black women.
Because French law required religious instructions for slaves, almost all the blacks in this area were Catholic prior to the Civil War. But the issue of slavery was often overlooked by the church.
If I had been asked to explain to a young Catholic, African American or a young white Catholic today, and to explain to them the history of bigotry and racism within the church and the particular expressions in the lives of priests and bishops and sisters and brothers, the first thing I would do is not deny it, nor would I attempt to explain it away or to give a gloss, to do a revisionist history. It is quite clear and absolutely accurate that there were bishops and archbishops and priests and monsignori and mothers general and sisters and brothers who were racist. The condition of being a prelate or a priest or a religious does not dispense one from the human condition. We are very much the same people that we were before hands were laid upon us, or vows taken, or religious garb donned. Now, having said that, I would also try to explain to them that there were also priests and bishops and sisters who attempted to put the gospel in practice, who had the courage to respond in truth, in charity, and in justice to the injustices that have been done to people of color throughout the history of this nation.
Those early religious made significant contributions. Many of their personal stories have been lost, but their commitment remained steadfast as more and more priests and sisters came to work in the Black community.
We're Dominicans, and so we live a four-pillared life. It's prayer, study, common life, and preaching. And that's the essence of our life. And preaching is very important because we do that in various and sundry ways. I think we all do that just by our very lives, and we do it by whatever our mission is, whatever our ministry is.
They were the people who sacrificed so much, I think, toward our upbringing. I remember them in that convent that they had in the school, and I often wondered how they survived that, because they were sort of cloistered in that area. And even now, I go back and I talk with the nuns, and I find out things that I never really knew about their life when they were at the school teaching us.
We're a daughter community of the Kentucky Dominicans, and so we started in Jacksonville, Illinois, and then we established ourselves as a mother house 20 years later after they established in Jacksonville to Springfield. And from there, our missions were established. And they went to East St. Louis, and they were very happy because it was a very Irish parish, St. Mary's, on 4th Street in Converse. And then, after the sisters were there several years, the African missionary fathers came to East St. Louis, and there was no Catholic religious education for any Black people in East St. Louis. So our sisters started to work with the African missionary fathers, and they were at St. Augustine's.
Well, if you look or talk to some of the old Catholics who went to St. Augustine, they had a very warm relationship with Father Taylor and Father Harrington. Father Harrington, of course, was instrumental in getting Catholicism established in East St. Louis.
The scars of slavery, social injustice, ethnic and cultural prejudice, and bigotry cannot be healed in the blink of an eye. The wounds go far deeper than the thick accent of an immigrant's speech or the color of a person's skin.
Slavery was economic. If you didn't have slavery, you didn't have capital. You couldn't build a capitalist economy without cheap labor. Now, if you start to believe that some people deserve to be cheap labor because of their skin color, then you build a system that's racial capitalism. And it's not a useful distinction to me to say it's either economics or race. It's both.
Sociologists talk about split labor markets. In other words, that certain jobs are reserved for certain people. And historically, what white ethnics have used is, at first it was blacks, and then it was Mexicans, and now it's Central Americans, to basically do the sorts of jobs that we don't care to do, and we want to pay people to do. And I think that's been part of the problem over time. And so in this region now, we have Mexican, Guatemalan, and Nicaraguan and Honduran farm workers who are being ministered to by a variety of churches. But face many of the same prejudices.
America was founded on the Christian desire to worship the Lord in an atmosphere of freedom, freedom of equality for all God's people. State and local laws attempted to outlaw slavery and enforce equality. With human behavior and attitudes difficult to change, separation of the races and ethnic groups polarized society. Churches and schools were easily segregated.
The descendants of the Irish and the Polish and the Germans look back with nostalgia upon those ethnic churches. But they look back with nostalgia on their roots. But in order to accommodate themselves and assimilate themselves into the American culture, they also had to take on a notion of cultural whiteness. And that's where you get the conflict. Because not only were you an Irish Catholic, but you were also striving very hard socially and politically to become a white American. And then you're going to get racism into it.
Ethnic and ideological differences were also rallying calls for social reform. Illinois was admitted to the Union in 1818 as a free state. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state. A series of events pushed this young nation to the brink of civil war. The Dred Scott case of the 1850s became one of the most controversial issues in the country. Dred Scott was an African-American slave. He had lived on free soil for a long time, and when his master died, Scott filed suit in St. Louis, Missouri, seeking his freedom. The case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, where 7 of 9 justices declared that no slave or descendant of a slave could be a U.S. citizen, and therefore had no rights in the eyes of the court. The decision had devastating consequences. The American Civil War broke out in 1861. Southern Illinois had strong Confederate sympathies, and there were differing views on slavery among ethnic groups. German Americans were strongly opposed to slavery, while French Americans, for the most part, supported it. The Catholic Church was divided on the issue.
Catholics at the time of the historical moment that led up to the Civil War, and certainly the moments of the Civil War, found most Catholics either silent in their leadership or silent in their political or social opinions, if not antagonistic. That's a sorry moment for the Catholic Church, and it's moments like these that Pope John Paul II says that we, at this moment, the turn of the millennium, ought to acknowledge and ask for forgiveness for sins of omission and commission, sins of being silent, and sins of even being engaged in oppression.
Southern Illinois played an important role during the war. Local historians have preserved that history.
During the Civil War, the beginning of the Civil War, where Fort Sumter, the shots were fired on it, the governor of the state of Illinois quickly sent troops to Cairo, because Cairo was the southernmost point of the North. Cairo is further south than Richmond, Virginia. And they sent General Ulysses S. Grant here. And with the 2 rivers here, Cairo was a strategic point. So Cairo in the Civil War was a key military location. It was from here that tens of thousands of troops embarked on riverboats and went to Nashville, Tennessee, went to Memphis, Vicksburg to conduct battles and successfully win these locations for the Union Army.
Without taking an official stand, the Catholic Church in Southern Illinois had a significant presence during the Civil War. More than 40 chaplains in the Union Army were Roman Catholic. Sisters of various orders worked as nurses on the battlefields and on hospital ships. The Sisters of the Holy Cross of Notre Dame, Indiana, went to Cairo and broke the law when they opened a hospital to care for fugitive slaves and freed men. When the government closed the hospital, they opened another one. These angels of the battlefield, as they were called, and those who lived their faith truly responded to the Old Testament words, "You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you, you shall not oppress him."
It was a town that had a free black community at the beginning of the Civil War. It was a town that was a major part of the route of the Underground Railroad. And it was a community of where there were also bounty hunters looking for runaway slaves to return to their masters. It was also a town that had what were called Negro nappers. These were people who would steal any black free or runaway slave and take them to where slave auctions were still going on in Louisville and Memphis and places, and sell them back into slavery for a profit. We've discovered sites where were built as part of our first levee system by the Illinois Central Railroad in 1853. They were underground storage vaults. And the Underground Railroad movement here in Cairo, when slaves would reach this point, they would hide them out in the free black community, and the black churches were involved in this. And some of the blacks who worked on the Illinois Central Railroad, which you have to keep in mind, only ran from Cairo to Chicago, because there were no bridges across the rivers in the 1860s. So the employees would have the runaway slaves who wanted to go further north come to the underground storage vaults, hide out there close to train time, and then get on the train and go further north. And that was an assistance that they felt was necessary for them to escape bounty hunters who were in Cairo. Cairo was kind of a wild, rough town because it was a river port, and there was gambling and prostitution, and with the military there were taverns and drinking, and it was kind of a rough place during the Civil War.
There was a few people came through Cairo on the Underground Railroad, but it's amazing how it splits, because a number of people in Cairo, whites, would return escaped blacks to the South. So it was kind of interesting. But I think it was also about economic competition and greed, in that the economy had, the white capitalists had taken a lot of raw goods like cotton and timber out. They'd made their profits and their fortunes, and then they shipped that and their children off elsewhere.
The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 freed more than 3 million slaves, but the struggle was far from over.
Many people believe the Emancipation Proclamation freed all blacks, but it didn't. It only freed blacks in those states under the Confederacy. Those states that were not under the Confederacy were allowed to keep slavery going until the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. So it was really 1866 before the blacks in other states were freed.
If I had to guess if the events of the post-Civil War period, which saw a great achievement and great accomplishments on the part of African Americans, there were African Americans in the House and in the Senate, the state legislatures, and some of the Convention.
Reconstruction gave blacks a lot of opportunities. You know, they served in state legislatures in Mississippi, they served in Congress and other places of that nature, but as they got into the 1880s and 1890s, there was opposition to all of the black progress, and laws were passed. The Ku Klux Klan was organized. There were bad court decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson, which says that separate but equal was lawful. So Cairo was a strong reflection of that, even though it was in the state of Illinois, and even though the Illinois Constitution prohibited separate school systems, prohibited, discrimination in the various public bodies and things of that nature, but the state played no role in enforcement. So while it took place here in Cairo, it was in great part a reflection of a great part of the state of Illinois.
While the most notable conflicts between people seem to involve race, make no mistake, heritage has also sparked many a clash. The last half of the 19th century saw freedmen moving out of the South and the immigrant population growing.
The people of Western Europe who came to this nation as immigrants, especially those who came as Catholics, were victims of bigotry and injustice. There is no question that they suffered because of their faith, because of their language, because of their heritage.
In 1897, Bishop John Jansen, the first bishop of the Belleville Diocese, appointed a German pastor to St. Patrick's Church in East St. Louis. The predominantly Irish congregation organized a protest. They surrounded the church. When the new pastor arrived one morning, he was thrown out on the street and told in ethnic slurs that the parish had no need for a priest of German heritage. Bishop Jansen called the action un-Catholic, narrow-minded nationalism, and threatened excommunication for all parishioners involved in the protest. The parish was closed for 4 months, and the dispute resolved only through direct intervention of the Vatican. Mostly unwritten, Jim Crow laws were laws of the land and created a society with things like separate drinking fountains, restrooms, and restaurants for whites and blacks.
African Americans have always been a missioned people. They weren't going to have an indigenous clergy or an autonomous clergy being raised up with them, so they were always being served by others, and that means that they were always being ministered to by people outside their own ethnic groups, whereas the Irish and the Lithuanians and the Germans and the Polish and the Germans, they all had their own clergy and kept up their institutions that way.
One of the most violent examples of intolerance in southern Illinois was a race riot in East St. Louis on July 2, 1917. Officially, 39 African Americans and 8 whites were killed. Some accounts, however, place the death toll at nearly 400 black men, women, and children. This did not start as a race riot. It was about jobs and pay. It was about feeding a family or going hungry. The battle lines were quickly drawn between black and white. It all started when black workers were brought in from the South to replace striking white workers in an aluminum ore mine.
Scab labor, and that's what I understood. That's what my mother was a teenager then. That's what I understood. My grandmother then said that's what happened. And killed off a lot of innocent people. Didn't know what was happening. See, and
a lot of homes were burned down on Division Avenue, all the way down.
They burned people up and just destroyed a home and things like that, and innocent people.
All of the big houses and doctor's offices and things from 8th Street, from 8th Street all the way down to Coswell Avenue on this side of the street were burned. Every one of them in the riot.
This race riot in East St. Louis in 1917 was considerably like the race riot in New York during the Civil War. It was a situation where the employers in the big industries are making profits. And so they decide then to kind of tighten the screws on their workers. And so the workers go on strike. Then the employers bring in strikebreakers. And if they bring in black strikebreakers, it has an element of race.
Rumors and fears of imminent genocide to eliminate blacks from the job market had been spreading for months. Then on the evening of July 1st, a Ford automobile with several white men inside drove through a black community, firing bullets into homes. A police car, similar to the Ford, was dispatched to investigate. As the police car with 2 plainclothes detectives turned into Bond Avenue from 10th Street, a frightened crowd of African Americans shot at the car, killing both police officers. By the following afternoon, angry mobs torched houses in the black neighborhoods. Men, women, and children were shot, beaten, and hanged. Some who witnessed the horrors shared their stories with younger generations, like Mary Newton's father.
He was 18 years old. He was working for the Illinois Central Railroad. He didn't have a car. He would take the train, because he was working for the railroad, from downtown Belleville to his job in East St. Louis. And in July of 1917, he got to work one day, and they were getting these emergency calls that people were being shot and everybody should go home. Everybody, for safety reasons, should leave the office and go home. So he got on the train to go home. And while he was riding home on the train through East St. Louis, he witnessed people being shot. He said there was a black couple running for the train as it slowed down at one of the stops. And he said the woman got on the train just as they heard a shot. She turned around and screamed, and her husband was laying dead right outside the car with the suitcase that he was carrying on top of him. And she got in the car, came and sat down in the seat right behind my dad and was crying. I mean, she was leaving because she realized if she didn't, she would be shot too. He said the next day, as he was coming, after things calmed down, he was coming to work the next day, that there were still some bodies being removed. He said he saw one little girl, just a small child, that was dead. You know, he was just so stunned, so amazed, so horrified that it's something that just stuck with him. And when the subject would come up, he'd talk about what a terrible event that had been.
I do remember my husband vividly telling stories that was told to him of the riots. The one thing that I remember the most was trying to get the women to safety on a barge that went across from East St. Louis to the St. Louis side. I remember one of the stories being of that, of trying to get the women and children to safety, and also of them hiding in the basement of the house where they felt safer than upstairs during that time. It was not a happy time. I remember that much about it.
And I remember my mother, I was from an area in East St. Louis called Goose Hill, surrounded by the meat packing places. And there was a lot of violence up there. And I remember her talking about old man Nash carrying guns in his hearse. It was a type of thing, when they would start talking about it, and obviously the visions would come back, and they would just get quiet. It was something that they didn't want to verbalize. It must have been awfully bloody and awfully ugly.
During the riot, journalists were detained, their cameras destroyed. Carlos Hurd, a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, wrote this: "For an hour and a half last evening, I saw the massacre of helpless Negroes at Broadway and 4th Street in downtown East St. Louis, where a black skin was a death warrant. I have read of St. Bartholomew's Night. I have learned of the latter-day crimes of the Turks in Armenia, and I have learned to loathe the German army for its barbarity in Belgium. But I do not believe that Muslim fanatics or Prussian frightfulness could perpetrate murders of more deliberate brutality than those which I saw committed in daylight by citizens of the state of Abraham Lincoln."
Now, it was horrible. There is no question. I remember when I was a little boy, we were driving through Illinois on one occasion across the MacArthur Bridge. We used to call it the Free Bridge then. And we went by this particular lot, was empty and kind of eerie feeling about it. My father said that's where that theater was that they burnt with the black people in it during the riot. And that was where quite a number of people were killed. If the people tried to get out, they would be shot. So it was barbaric, it was awful.
Some accounts of that frightful day and night have been found in diaries and personal letters. Daisy Westbrook was director of music and drawing at Lincoln High School in 1917 when she wrote,
"Dearest Louise, was very glad to hear from you. Your letter was forwarded from what used to be our house. Louise, it was awful. I hardly know where to begin telling you about it. First, I will say we lost everything but what we had on, and that was very little."
Miss Westbrook vividly described her family's narrow escape from an angry mob and the burning of their home. The letter continues,
"The papers did not report all the horrors. People were being shot down and thrown back into the fire if they tried to escape. Some were shot and then burned. Others were dragged around with ropes about their necks. One man was hung to a telegraph post. Another man and his wife, a shopkeeper, were burned alive across in front of our house."
I was going to say, I remember stories about Uncle Sonny, who apparently worked for a funeral parlor. And the way that they used to get guns to Rush City was in the coffins. And so they would let the funeral workers transport bodies, because there was an awful lot of killing, it seems like. And so it's probably had an awful lot of sad stories. And you stop to think about that type of oppression and the oppression of racism in general, you know, it's not a favorite thing. And I find now that a lot of older people really feel uncomfortable.
People don't sit around and reminisce about times when we were being killed. We don't reminisce about that unless it's for a point. And that story, I may have heard it a couple times growing up. And all I ever heard was, that was 1917. My father was born in 1897, so he'd have been 20 years old. He had gone off to college and come back. And by that time, my grandparents, his parents, had moved into East St. Louis. And they were living downtown. 9th Street, 10th Street, whatever street. I mean, I don't remember. And people were being hidden from the mobs. And people were being beat up on the streets. And all I ever heard him say was, and we had to hide people in our house. And it was awful. That was it. And I didn't hear, my grandmother never talked about it, except to say, mm-hmm.
Well, I know my grandmother and great-grandmother, they said how people would, some of them left East St. Louis, went across the river, never did come back anymore, you know. It was so bad during that time, during that era.
History records countless tales of man's struggle to follow Christ. For African Americans, the struggle is especially difficult in the darkness of racism and bigotry. Theirs is a deep faith that endures. And for 2,000 years, all Christians have been challenged to a deeper understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
We as bishops are faced with a very significant challenge. We have to help our people see the close union, the close bond between faith and social justice, doctrine and practice, morality and dogma. It is not possible to be a good Catholic without seeing the challenges of the gospel, not just in what we believe, but in how we act. Our understanding of the sacraments is not simply a belief in the real presence, but that our belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist demands that we treat people, all people, as we would treat Christ.
At the beginning of the 20th century, East St. Louis was a growing manufacturing center and the major railway center in southern Illinois. When war broke out in Europe, businesses here boomed with demands for military supplies. Many black families migrated north to the land of promise. They brought with them a deep religious spirituality. The Catholic Church saw fertile ground that could yield great fruits for Christ. Missionaries were invited to work in the black community and bring converts to the church. In East St. Louis and in much of the Diocese of Belleville, religious sisters taught all who came to them.
I never felt like I was a missionary there, but I guess when I think about it, I guess we were. But I was there to do what I could for the children. And most of the children I had there were very few Catholics in the school at that time. But, you know, whatever I could give the children, and part of our lessons every day were about God and about Jesus and about Mary and about the church, and they loved it. You know, they loved to sing, they loved to participate in that, and I just never thought about them not being part of the same faith I was, because I saw a faith there. They had a faith in God.
Well, to be honest with you, I didn't know what to expect. But when I walked into that classroom on Monday morning, I couldn't believe that there was 71 children sitting there in front of me. And it was a whole new atmosphere for me. But I loved every minute of it, all the years that I was there.
It was very interesting. We taught in an old brewery, and I had the hitching post in my room, and the hayloft was above me, and the manger was on the side, and we made tissue paper curtains for the windows, and we really put old paint together. We put about 4 different kinds of paint together to paint the desks, and it was quite a sight, but it was clean and nice. And as one of the sisters said, we did our own janitor work, so we could fix it up the way we liked it.
I think they felt like they were really loved by the sisters, and I think they felt like they could come and visit us, and they could come and be with us, and they could feel at home with us. And I think that is why there were a number of conversions among the children.
Christians are called to open wide their arms and welcome to all who seek to know Christ. But the doors of the Catholic Church have not always been open to all people.
My husband and I had lived in southern Illinois for a short time, and he was Methodist and I was Baptist, and I said, we've got to do something for these 2 children we have. We've got to put them in church somewhere. And we decided that we would go take instructions there in Mound City, Illinois. And after we got started in our instructions, the congregation told the priest that if he taught us the instructions, they wouldn't support him, and to send us over to Cairo for our instructions. We had no transportation, didn't hardly have food. We decided we would come back to East St. Louis because I was the only one working, making $1.25 a week, $1.50 a week, and we had a chance to bring the children and me back to East St. Louis, so we stayed here.
Father Joseph Brown grew up in East St. Louis. He is the first black priest to be ordained in the Diocese of Belleville. Not long after his parents were married, they chose to become Catholic. Their journey of faith was not an easy one.
I think that it came from several streams. The decision was a confluence of influences. And my mother had always thought about being Catholic because she really did appreciate the treatment she had received as a child from Catholic nuns and priests who were social activists and doing a lot of social work in the black community in the 1920s and 30s. My father never told why he did, except that he was always very inquisitive intellectually and was very consistent with the way he lived out his faith. Now, I heard this, you know, how families all tell different versions of different stories depending on which member of the family you're talking to. And I had heard one version of that story was that both my mother and father had been away from their home churches. And my grandparents and they all decided that once the children were born in the family that they really needed some church upbringing, and that was kind of the impetus to find the appropriate church. And because my father, too, had been working in social work, in community development, he, too, had a very positive experience with the priests and nuns who were working as missionaries among the black people. And I think that that really was what cemented their choice. And I think that was true for a number of young black families, young black couples in East St. Louis at that time, that the work of the church, because social activism was really a mainstay of church teaching and practice in the 1920s and 30s and 40s in this country, especially in the Midwest. So I think that their appreciation for the priests and nuns who were doing the right thing helped invite them into the church.
Well, after I returned from military service, I was a Protestant, so I was engaged to my childhood girlfriend, which is sitting here. So she was a Catholic, so I was converted to Catholicism because I want to marry her, so I spent the rest of my life with her. So here I am now after 51 years. So
I was born into a Catholic family. My mother and my uncle and my grandparents were Catholic. I was born in St. Louis, and I was baptized before I left the hospital. So I've been Catholic all my life.
Well, I became a Catholic in 1981, I think it was. I basically grew up Baptist, and we've always been, you know, a religious family. I guess, you know, I can't imagine black people not being religious. I mean, that's just the way we are. I mean, what else would we have to hold on to?
We are a people who have found such solace and hope and strength in a religious tradition that is grounded in prayer, is grounded in celebration, is grounded in scripture, is grounded in a sense of the transcendent God that I find it almost impossible to imagine being a member of this community called the African American community and not have religion so much a part of it.
I felt very keenly the injustice that was there, and I prayed very deeply for those people because I think I felt their hurt very keenly inside of me. And I probably would not have felt that if I had not been in an area that was mostly black or mostly African American. Mm-hmm.
We're all supposed to be Christians and Catholics and what have you, and to think that there was this faction of people that couldn't go into restaurants or couldn't go in, use the drinking fountain or whatever, ride the buses, they had to go to the back of the bus. I just couldn't understand that.
So that our challenge as bishops is to help our people not live disjunct Catholic lives, but lives of cohesiveness, where faith and justice and dogma and doctrine and social activism are not seen as somehow two different ways of being a Catholic, but one way of living the faith of the Church.
I found myself praying for them a lot and praying with them. But I don't think it changed me all that much because I just felt like, you know, that they were connected with me and we were in prayer together. You know, we were all the same. God is our Father, so it makes us all brothers and sisters.
The African American bishops in 1984, of which I was proud to be both an author and a signer of our pastoral letter and what we have seen and heard, we attempted to describe that spiritual vision as an energy, as a positive, life-giving force that allows us to express the depths of our personal religious feelings in a corporate reality, in a corporate way. In a sense, black spirituality is very Catholic because it's communitarian. It belongs to a people. It's a shared experience. It is a religious spiritual vision that sees the individual as rooted in a community and as an individual who finds his identity within the community. Those are very Catholic realities. It is deeply scriptural. It is grounded in God's Word. And that's very sacramental, because the sacramental action of the church always rises out of a hearing of God's Word.
For more than 300 years, from the first slaves to those African Americans today who remain faithful members of the body of Christ, God's Word has been the reason for their perseverance, commitment, and ultimately hope in the Catholic Church. Despite the bigotry and oppression, they have remained faithful to the Church. And along the way, they have come to see the Church as more than just its buildings, statues, and icons.
Well, my opinion, I am the church. That building is just the building we go into to worship. I am the church. We are the church. The church is in me.